Everyone, I'm Larry Allen. So I want to welcome you to the PCI Practical Matters podcast. Today, we are going to bow our heads and do a memorial service for our fallen friend, commercial item acquisition. So before we start, we need, like any good service, to have a moment of silence. Thank you. Commercial item acquisition was born in the early 1990s with the best of intentions. In its infancy, commercial item acquisition always drew a lot of skepticism from DoD stalwarts who liked things their own way and were used to having lots of government specifications for things, even so much as how many pieces a broken ashtray should break into. And then in its teenage years, we had reinventing government. Reinventing government was the Al Gore, Vice President Al Gore's big project, and that was really when commercial item acquisition gained strength, and it seemed like we'd turned the corner in government towards buying commercial items first and then really streamlining acquisition. It's not every day we get a couple of pieces of legislation that deal with government contracting, but in the 1990s we had several, all of which were targeted at making it easier for the government to buy commercial items. Then in the early 2000s, tragedy began to strike. Commercial item acquisition was first, had the legs taken out from under it with some of the aftermath of new rules that came in with the Afghan and Iraq wars. A lot of oversight, a lot of things that kept across the board. The commercial item acquisition, even though it wasn't really responsible for some of the problems, got caught up in them nevertheless. Now we've had commercial item acquisition, particularly the streamlined version on life support. It's been in hospice, and it's been terrible to watch the demise of our good friend commercial item acquisition. It was not with us nearly long enough. And like many who have gone too soon, common sense commercial item acquisition will be remembered for all of the many great contributions it did make. Now, the final nails in the coffin were seated by an increased number of specialized government rules, some of which, like cybersecurity, had the best of intentions, others which aimed to achieve socioeconomic goals that didn't really have much to do with the core acquisition mission, bogged down commercial item acquisition to the point where, unfortunately, earlier this year, common sense, streamlined commercial item acquisition gave up its ghost. Here to help me memorialize commercial item acquisition is my good friend and longtime colleague, Rob Burton. Rob's with Crowell Mooring, but that doesn't really do him justice. He has a long and storied career in government acquisition. And because this is a self-serve podcast, I'm going to let Rob introduce himself.
Larry, thanks so much. I knew you were a good comedian, but this is great. Thanks for having me, Larry. So I grew up in the federal government. I grew up in the Department of Defense. I was in the Department of Defense for a long time. And then I became the Deputy and Acting Administrator of the Office of Federal Procurement Policy at OMB, and I did that for quite some time. Then I retired from the federal government and I went to the private sector, and I've been at doing the law firm thing for almost 15 years now. Now, if you are good at math, you're going to figure out, oh gosh, this guy is actually getting up there in age. But over 40 years in federal acquisition, I guess 45 years. And I guess I've seen it all. I've lived through this whole commercial item. It's quite an interesting history, quite an interesting road that it's gone through and traveled. But I do think that the government has a very difficult time, with commercial item acquisition. It was supposed to be something that was simple. The government just can't do things in a simple way. And it's been really interesting for me, Larry, to have had the government experience and then the private sector experience to try to really see where the disconnects are. And it's really quite interesting. And I'm sure there are a lot of people like me who say, geez, if I could only go back into the government now, maybe I could try to fix some of the things. because I have a much better understanding where the government simply is getting it wrong or just simply has trouble doing it the way the commercial world does it. And I think the government's always been somewhat envious of the private sector and the fact that they can do acquisition arguably much quicker and much more efficiently than the federal government. And we're going to be talking, Larry, today about why that is and why maybe we're somewhat pessimistic with respect to whether the government ever can really act like a commercial entity.
So, Rob, thanks for doing that introduction. Happy to have you here. Rob, in fact, ladies and gentlemen, is my first guest on the PCI Practical Matters podcast. So let's jump in, Rob. Obviously, if the government created commercial item acquisition in the first place, particularly trying to streamline the acquisition for commercial goods and services, there must have been something wrong with the acquisition system. What was it, and what was it that commercial item acquisition was supposed to fix?
Well, here's a good one for you, Larry. So I remember when I was in the Department of Defense, I would do training for contracting people. Even though here I was a lawyer, I would get into doing basic training. And I remember just for joke material, I would have a statement of work for example, toilet paper or a toothbrush. Remember, this is Department of Defense, and the Department of Defense is special, right? Everything has to be slightly different if you're in the Department of Defense. So toilet paper has to be slightly different than what you're going to be using, generally speaking. Same thing with a toothbrush, going to be slightly different, but it really wasn't, right? So I would have these diagrams, which would be attached to the statement of work, describing the item. The statement of work would be like 15 pages long, describing the item, and then it came with a diagram, which actually you had to fold out like this. Had to fold it out, so it was about 2 feet long, and it would show a toothbrush, and it would go into great detail about the bristles and how they need to be constructed and so forth. Same thing with the toilet paper. Each ply of paper, exactly what would be the composition of the paper and how many little wood particles could you have in each ply of paper. This was insane, right? So I mean, and people would laugh and got a really good chuckle out of it. But it was a serious issue, because here you have contractors trying to respond to solicitations with these requirements for the simplest thing. And I think at some point in time, even in the Department of Defense, it sort of hit people that this was not probably the most efficient way to do acquisition. Why are we doing this type of procurement when I can go down to Walmart and buy the toothbrush, okay? I mean, why do we think it has to be so difficult? And so I think there was a move afoot to do away with the insanity, because this really was insane, right? I mean, and the diagrams that I was showing for common use items, I think really made the point that, folks, we've got to simplify acquisition. And then there was a move afoot to have innovative technology and so forth. And even to this day, you have companies that are like, I don't want to deal with the federal government. All right, you're too complex, you're too difficult to deal with. I don't want to deal with you. And I think at least in the Department of Defense, people started looking around going, maybe this is really serious. Maybe we are not going to get innovative technology to the extent we should. And we want to bring that from the private sector into the federal government. How do we do that? Simplification was the answer. We have to be more simple. Our procurement system simply has to be less bureaucratic, less regulations. So here's where this whole impetus was to go to commercial item acquisition.
And it was really kind of a rare time, Rob. It was rare in that you kind of had government and industry coming together and saying, okay, we really need to do this. And as I mentioned in my introduction, we had a Democratic Vice President, Al Gore, and his Reinventing Government initiative. But we also had at the same time a Republican-controlled House of Representatives. Yet despite that, everybody came together to get a lot of this done. And I remember it being a very different time. It was an exciting time to be in acquisition, particularly with all the development of technology and some of the things that people couldn't believe they could actually buy professional services as easy as they have been buying them up until recently. So there was a lot there. Rob, from your perspective, what were some of the big payoffs that the government benefited from in commercial item acquisition?
Well, in the early years, I think we were all fairly optimistic. It was like, boy, the government's actually getting quite creative here. And there was excitement about bringing commercial practices to the federal government. There's no question that in the early years, there was more competition. There was, guess what? And with more competition, you get better pricing. Prices usually come down with more competition. And you did get new entrants into the federal space. You had companies actually entering, commercial companies entering into the federal space for the first time. There were many, many things that were going along that people got excited about. And probably one of the major things, Larry, was the fact that procurements were faster, right? I mean, there was actually a faster process, which the government knew that we have really created a very elongated process that just does not have any rationality to it. And so back in the day, there was optimism and there was a hope that we could become more commercial-like. I will say this though, Larry, even in the early days, there were still a number of mandatory FAR clauses that were seeping into commercial item acquisition. And maybe the seeds of failure were already planted at the very beginning, because it was like, oh, well, we only have like 50 mandatory FAR clauses that we're going to be putting into commercial item acquisitions. Query, why that many? And we did it. I had some folks just a couple years ago, Larry, take a look at the growth of FAR clauses in commercial contracts. So I don't know I can't remember, but it went from like 50 in the early 1990s to several hundred. Over each decade, we got more and more mandatory FAR clauses. So now, today, a commercial item contract really doesn't look a whole lot different, than some of these other procurements that the government does.
Right, and even simplified acquisitions, I think it's important to note, are really only simplified relative to other types of government acquisitions. I think a lot of new market entries come in and say, hey, smaller dollar buys, simplified acquisition. Well, that's really not the case unless you understand what the rest of government acquisition looks like. And then and only then does that relative understanding sink in. And it does result in companies that either come into the market and then leave, or some companies, some very large commercial companies that could really spur competition, give you today's technology today, they're electing to sit on the sidelines just because they don't want to put the infrastructure together for what for them is going to be a relatively small piece of business, even though it looks big to people like you and me who are inside the arena. So Rob, you mentioned that the seeds of doom may have been planted right at the birth of commercial item acquisition. We know that this was an American-sponsored phenomenon, just like any other American phenomena. It gets overweight, the arteries get clogged, things slow down. Do you think this accretion was inevitable?
You know what, Larry, I do. And I don't want to be terribly pessimistic here, but I think I'm going to give you a realistic point of view. Federal acquisition is different than commercial acquisition. I think it always will be. And the principal reason is that the government has social and economic objectives and goals that it implements through the acquisition process. We are seeing that today probably more than ever with the Biden administration. So, right, and they don't care whether it's commercial or non-commercial. It's like we have certain social and economic goals that we want to affect through procurement, whether it be commercial or not. So we may have a vaccine mandate. We may have climate change issues that would be still of interest in commercial item acquisitions just as much as any other acquisition. We have a minimum wage requirement, right? The contractors have to pay their employees a minimum wage, and that has to be affected through the procurement process. It really has nothing to do with acquisition or the acquisition process, but these are social and economic goal requirements that are effectively implemented, quite frankly, through the acquisition process, and more awards to small business. So just because it's a commercial item acquisition doesn't mean it shouldn't go to a small business. This is a goal of the government to increase dollars going to small business. Not necessarily a bad goal, but you just have to be realistic that the procurement process will be used to implement these goals. Therefore, even though it may be a commercial simplified acquisition, you are still going to have these requirements, seeping into the acquisition. And I think that's inevitable. Every administration does pursue social and economic goals through the procurement process, and it's simply not going to change.
So Rob, one of the phenomena that's come out of all of this is, keeping on with the cardiac reference, it's almost been like bypass surgery, procurement bypass. So you've had people get very creative, sometimes using authorization they had, sometimes using new ways to acquire things. But there's been a kind of a real explosion as the main highways, the main arteries get clogged. People have come up with ideas to do things that bypass that, right? Things like other transaction authority, micro purchases. Is that having any real impact, or is that just a real indication that the patient overall is sick?
Well, Larry, this is an interesting point. I'm glad you're raising it. So let's take first other transactions. Again, a lot of optimism, a lot of hope, innovative. It was like, we're going to give you a bypass route, and you'll be able to negotiate just like you can negotiate in the private sector, sit down across the table and come up with a contract. Forget those FAR clauses. You will be creative here. We'll act like we are in the commercial world, and we'll come up with an agreement that's not FAR based. Well, guess what happened over the years? Contracting officers just love the FAR. They love the FAR. I call it really bureaucratic complexity. The government likes bureaucratic complexity. They're sort of trained in it. They're really quite good at it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, we've got to go back to the FAR. So we have so many clients. There are exceptions to the rule, and there have been some really good creative, innovative other transactions that have actually been implemented. However, I think generally speaking, clients have been very frustrated that when they sit down at the table with the contracting officer pulls out the FAR and it says, well, we got to have this clause. Okay, look, there's nothing I can do about it. I'm sorry, but we're going to have this clause. And guess what? All of a sudden, after you finish your negotiation, your contract really looks like a good old FAR contract with 200 mandatory clauses in it. So it has not, in my view, OAs have not been have not turned out to be what everybody hoped they would be, which is really simplified acquisition.
Ails you.
Yeah, right, exactly.
So Rob, a lot of people, myself included, tend to look at government procurement as a pendulum, and the pendulum never stops in the middle. It goes back and forth. We really arguably had, some very good times when we rolled back regulations that impeded commercial item acquisition. Now we've gone back kind of almost to the other side, although it's probably a little bit more to go for that pendulum to swing in the direction it's currently going in. But is there a chance that we might actually get back to having the pendulum swing the other way, and that some of the benefits that were originally perceived from streamlined commercial item acquisition might be reclaimed?
So on that point, let me go back to what you already mentioned. You alluded to e-marketplaces. If there is any hope in the future for the government to become more commercial-like, it's going to be through e-marketplaces. So the commercial world, if you will, is buying more and more things through e-marketplaces, and the government is beginning to move in that direction because Congress, again, we have these lofty goals. Congress directed GSA back in the 2018 NDAA to set up an e-marketplace portal. There are 3 e-marketplaces that are participating on that GSA portal. And my understanding is that it's working quite well, but it also indicates that we still have a problem. So it's very interesting. The government is pressuring these e-marketplaces. Here we go. It's like deja vu, right? The government's pressuring these e-marketplaces to become more government-like. It's like, well, wait a minute. you got to have what's called an 889 certification. All your suppliers, we have to be sure that these suppliers, when they sell commercial items to the government, we got to make sure that none of the items or components are coming from China. You're going to have to do a certification to tell us for sure that your suppliers are not providing parts from China, or at least from certain companies in China. So all of a sudden it's like, okay, we got that requirement. And then it's like, well, wait a minute, we'd also like to have preferred buying. We'd like to be able to show the small businesses that provide this commercial item. Oh, what about an Ability One storefront? Can you do that? So our buyers can see the Ability One products that they really need to go to first before they look at any other commercial items that might be provided on that marketplace. All of a sudden, you're trying to get the marketplace to become more government-like. That said, it's still way more simple than if we go to traditional procurement. So I think during COVID, you saw a lot more procurement going through e-marketplace. They raised for emergency procurements, they raised the micro purchase threshold from 10,000 to 20,000. You saw a lot more activity on e-marketplaces because everybody's working at home. And I think people realized, oh, this is really simple. And it's just like how I buy it when I'm buying things in my personal capacity at home. I'm just buying them for the government with a government purchase card. I think this e-marketplace phenomenon is the hope of the future. And I think you're going to see more and more agencies going to e-marketplace procurement, which will be irrespective of the fact that the government really wants to make it more government-like. It feels more comfortable, right? Having these certifications and so forth. I don't think we're going to end up with hundreds and hundreds of mandatory FAR clauses in the e-marketplace world. So that, I think, is the hope of the future, that we will become more commercial-like as the government uses e-marketplaces more. I just think it's somewhat humorous that even in that very simplistic world, the government does want to make it more complicated.
Right, and of course, right there with the e-marketplace program is another government procurement unique factor. We're in the middle of a protest right now over the recompete of that contract that's holding everything up. You don't really get that in commercial item acquisition. If somebody says, well, I'm protesting what you're doing, GM's going to be like, noted, and they're going to go on and do their thing. So, Rob, if commercial item acquisition is dead, at least the common sense streamlined version, what does the future hold for common sense government procurement overall? Are we just kind of stuck in this area to a certain extent, or is there going to be any opportunity to break through?
Well, I will say that as frustrating as our procurement system is, it is the best in the world. And I remember when I was at OFPP, I chaired an international group on best practices in procurement. And it was fascinating to me to see every one of these countries saying, we really would like our procurement system to be more like yours. We really would like to have a FAR. We really would like to have a system where bribery is not the way of doing business. So as much as we would like our system to be better than it is and more commercial-like, if you will, it is the best procurement system in the world. And I think that certainly it can be improved, no question about it. And I do think maybe we're taking baby steps in that direction. And so I'm not terribly pessimistic. I do think from a realistic, as I said before, from a realistic standpoint, the government will never be able to be totally commercial-like. And I think it's unrealistic to think that it can, because of these social and economic objectives which are pushed through the procurement system, and they always will be. And you mentioned protest. We're always going to have protest, and that's something you don't see in the commercial world. That's unique to the government, and it's going to remain unique. And arguably, maybe we should even have the opportunity for companies to protest more than they do. There's a I don't know what it's up to now with respect to task orders. You can't just protest any particular task order. It has to be over a certain monetary threshold. And so we are restricting protest to some extent now more than ever. And a lot of people are upset about that. You know, a lot of companies feel like that's not fair. They would still like to have the opportunity to protest. So many of the things that are unique to the government, like protests, are mechanisms that are cherished by the private sector, and the private sector actually generally likes them, especially you know, if it does result in some type of remedy or some type of competitive opportunity that they may not have had otherwise. So you know, there's a double-edged sword to everything, and so if we look at the positives, there are also negatives and vice versa. But I think the bottom line is the government is dying to have new entrants into the federal government. Larry, the industrial base is at risk. The number of contractors dealing with the federal government has decreased, I think, by 60% over the last 10 years. It is a dramatic decrease in the number of companies dealing with the federal government. And I think the government is beginning to get that wake-up call that if you want to increase the number of new entrants, if you want to have innovation, if you want to have competition and better pricing, you are going to have to simplify the system. That doesn't mean it will ever be totally commercial-like, but you are going to have to simplify the system. And I do think right now in Congress and in the administration, you are seeing an appetite for simplification. So I am optimistic that we are going to see some movement to a more commercial-like federal system, because I think there's no choice. There's no choice. Otherwise, the industrial base will continue to shrink, which is not good for anybody.
So Rob, I think that's a great answer. Thanks so much for those insights. I think what you're really trying to say, and here we are at the conclusion of the memorial service for commercial item acquisition, and like any good memorial service, yea, though I walk through the valley of procurement darkness, I will fear no regulatory evil. So Rob Burton from Crowell Mooring, over 45 years of experience in government acquisition. Thanks so much for being my first guest today on the PCI Practical Matters podcast. I'm Larry Allen with Allen Federal. Join us next time here on the PCI Practical Matters podcast series.
This has been the PCI Practical Matters podcast. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and we hope you listen next time.